first time. Like many of you, I first met Gretta Vosper through her writing. Her book, With or Without God, had just been released, and I was living in the Toronto area, attempting to begin and develop a new spiritual community, and desperate to know how to move through and beyond the writings that I and many of you had been reading forever: Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, closer to home, Tom Harper. And I found my first glimpse of an honest answer to that question, to what's next after those people. When I read in Gretta's book that honest answer. Then I first met Gretta and Scott in person as I visited West Hill United as often as I could in 2008 and 9. The great thing about building and planting new congregations is it's usually not Sunday morning work. So I had Sunday mornings, and I often found myself at West Hill, although I was inconspicuous. And so the next time I met Gretta, she said, "Really? You were there?" So yeah. But at that time, I learned to appreciate the community, the music, the honest intellectual and spiritual inquiry that I found in the West Hill congregation. Gretta is the author of 2 books, With or Without God, Why the Way We Live is More Important Than What We Believe, and Amen, What Prayer Can Mean in a World Beyond Belief. Not a title she herself chose, but a book about prayer and what it might mean for us today. She's published 3 books of poetry and prayers, and most recently, as Nancy mentioned, compiled a collection of her writings and presentations and speeches. Gretta founded the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity that in its life from 2004 until 2016 succeeded in providing a network and connecting place for those seeking a progressive path. In addition to providing support to those who might feel alone on that journey, the CCPC provided a place of spiritual thought, principles and values, and through its website, resources that were inspiring to contemporary seekers. Gretta grew up in the United Church of Canada and was shaped by its outlook, its theological inquiry, and its contributions to seeking justice. She recently, this summer, celebrated 20 years at West Hill United Church as their minister. In her ministry, in my personal opinion, she has a particular gift for reframing the best of our tradition. Reframing it, making it relevant and meaningful to those beyond the once-thought boundaries of the Christian church. As most boundary pushers, she tends to initiate a lot of conversations, and this, she contends, is good for the United Church. The more we talk about both our different perspectives and what we hold in common, the healthier will our church be in the future. As she says on her website, let's start a conversation about just and compassionate living. I believe people can support each other with love and wisdom in a church with or without the God called God. Have questions? Let's connect and discuss. She said that she's irritating the church into the 21st century. And some bristle at the agitation while others welcome it. And regardless of where any of us are on that spectrum, all are welcome in the conversation. And Gretta will be the first to celebrate that conversation can happen. Here, in other pockets around the country, around coffee tables, in church basements. And at the same time, I think, and I know that she wishes that conversation can happen even more deeply and denominationally. We're happy to have Gretta Vosper here this weekend. I wish I'd known in 2008 what I now know, in that she is an amazing connoisseur of donuts and can pick the best donut in a donut shop, hands down. We're happy to have her here this weekend, donuts or no donuts, to be part of the deep dialogue and the friendships that are built and strengthened among us. So friends, Let's welcome Gretta Vosper.
There's that. Excellent, thank you. There's a beautiful glare right on the iPad right here, isn't there? Yeah. This is a little wowie. Can we pull it back a bit? Or is that my fault?
No.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Okay, let me find the document I'm looking for, and then we'll get moving. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Since the government has required that coffee shops and donut places put the caloric content on, my consumption of donuts has gone down considerably, I must say. So, anyway, but it was lovely to get to know you more. Personally, while we were together in Portland at the conference that took place this past May, sponsored by the Progressive Christian organization in the States, which was called the Center for Progressive Christianity, and now really goes by progressivechristianity.org, and many of you will be familiar with that. So I want to express appreciation to you and Nancy, to Chris and Nancy, for pulling this together, for taking this responsibility on. Nancy, as one of the members of the board of the CCPC, agreed with the board that we would try to do something that would acknowledge the closure of that organization. And she valiantly, probably with some kind of persuasive efforts here at home, convinced Chris to take on pulling together people from across the country and out of the country to come together and have this this conversation to keep it going. And so I'm very grateful to you for doing that, and to all the people with the yellow taggers. Like, you have done a phenomenal job. I'm particularly impressed with the critical illness stuff and that goes in that. Like, that was just a brilliant idea. So if anything happens to me in the middle of this, my name tag is over there. You can get the information from over there. So I really want to express my gratitude for that, and to the musicians who have helped us for your movement. I didn't do it because I had to remember other things then, but I did take some pictures. So anyway, so thank you for that. And to those who have supported the CCPC throughout its history, many of you are here, some of you were on the board, others have been supportive of that over the course of the years of its work in this field, and so I want to express appreciation for that. And today my topic is shopping with the nuns, and I'm going to explore that with you a bit. We all, I'm assuming most of you know who the nuns are. They're those people who on surveys about census surveys and things like that identify as having no religion. There's always those categories: what religion are you? And there's no religious affiliation. And those are the people who are identified as the nuns now. And some of them embrace that term, and some of them rail against that term because of its negative connotations. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to them today as that group. And I'm going to start really by talking about my own work and how it came to be, and what I've focused on for the last 16 years at West Hill. And then move into the conversation about the nuns from that perspective. So there were two things that formed who I became as a minister. The first one is my Sunday school, and the second was my theological training. And my Sunday school taught me three things. And many of you, if you were raised in the United Church of Canada, you might recognize these things. If you were raised in another church, Scott raised in the Baptist church, would not have recognized these things from his Sunday school experience. In fact, the curriculum that was used in my Sunday school, the new curriculum, which was popular between 1964 and 1971 when they stopped publishing it because it taxed teachers too heavily and required too much of them. So they stopped publishing it, unfortunately. But when that curriculum was published, published. Up until that point, the Baptist Church in Canada and the United Church of Canada had collaborated a lot on their resources, using the same publishing houses and sharing things. You'll know what color was the hymn book in our pews? Black hymn book when I was growing up was the same hymn book with a blue cover in the Baptist Church. So we shared a lot of things. But when the new curriculum came out, there was sort of a line drawn in the sand. And Scott's father, who was a Baptist minister, was one of those who marched on Church House to argue against and to lament the publication of that new curriculum. So the three things that I learned in Sunday school, without knowing there was such a thing as a new curriculum at all, I just went to Sunday school the way everyone else did, was that God is love. That was one of the main things that I was taught, that Jesus was a nice guy who could teach me a lot of things, and that the Bible had some of those stories about what he could teach me. I could learn from the stories that were in the Bible. Because I learned that he was someone who could teach me things, he also, and I note this in one of my books, he taught me to skate in the backyard on the little ice rink that my mother made, and I was excited about that. But in my book, I note that he was a Palestinian and so didn't know how to skate, and I've never really been able to do it well either as a result of that. My theological education was much more advanced, however. When I went to theological college at Queen's University in a class of about 20 people, which was fairly large at that time, I learned more deeply about some of those things. So I learned primarily that the Bible is a human construction. We were taught to go at the Bible using human tools of critical inquiry, and we're given, if we didn't have those coming in, we were given those tools. Many of us did have it coming in, but we took the Bible apart and explored it. One of my professors of New Testament was Rabbi Herb Basser, and he said to us at the very beginning of a class, I think it was on Mark, he said to us, I don't have to deal with these scriptures. When we're finished with this, you're the ones that are going to have to take it back as scripture. Which should have been like a huge warning to all of us. But I learned that the Bible is a human construction, and it tells the story of faith in exactly the same way that most of human history is told. That is, in the voice of the victors. The Bible is the collection of those stories that won out over the other stories, of those perspectives that were stronger and louder than the other stories. And that's one of the things that I learned at theological college. The other thing I learned was that not just is God love, but that's one of the many concepts of God that are out there. We were taught about God as a concept, and we were displayed the myriad ways in which that concept was wrestled with over the millennia, straight through the roots of our tradition and around the world in so many different iterations. And they were diverse and sometimes mutually exclusive. But to explore them was to explore something that came out of the human capacity for imagination and creativity, for the capacity to wrestle with difficult concepts and find ways to tell them anew for new generations. But a concept does not live without a human brain. It doesn't exist without a human brain, and that was embedded in me in my theological understanding. And I learned, too, that Jesus, beside being a lousy skater, was, as Marcus Borg used to say, and I heard him say this, and I wrote it down at one of the homiletics festivals in the States many, many years ago, and he was speaking about an opportunity that he'd been given to speak on it might have been National Public Radio or something, but it was early on, and he was very excited about being able to get out everything he knew in those few moments that he was going to be on the radio. So he created this definition about who Jesus was that would fit that little skinny time that he was going to be having the opportunity to use on radio. And so he created this, and he memorized the whole thing, and she never asked the question. And he was devastated. So he gave it in the homiletics time, and I wrote it down. But the piece that I remember the most is that Jesus was an itinerant Middle Eastern preacher who may have had some healing skills. And that's the kinds of things that I learned in theological college. So when I went out to be a minister in a congregation, I wasn't ordained to begin with. I got ordained a year later. They hadn't been able to give me a settlement position. But I began my work in Toronto at St. Matthew's United Church and was ordained while I was there. And I spent much of my time doing one of the things that Christopher so beautifully described, but creating ways for us to explore and experience that were deeply emotional, that galvanized us emotionally and psychologically, engaged us, and called us out of the space in a new way. It was a very creative endeavor. No one in my congregation liked it. They couldn't stand. Some of them even left me anonymous voicemail messages at home when they were really ticked about something I had done. The thing was that even when I did things in a very orthodox manner, they hated that too. So it meant that I could really just explore and do anything I wanted because it didn't make any difference to them. So I developed my sense of leadership while there. Who I was going to be as a minister was developed in that congregation. It took me several years to get to that appreciative understanding of it, I must say. But it was an opportunity for me to really find my roots in this tradition and determine how I wanted to speak about it going forward. And so on my way to West Hill United Church on the first Sunday there, I can remember we went down the dip on Morningside Avenue, if any of you know it, and then you come back up out of the valley. And on the way back up out of the valley, on our way to the first Sunday, I was sure I was going to wake up and find out it was really a dream that I was going to a new church, because I had been embraced by these people already in a way that I had not experienced in ministry in any significant way. They had welcomed me, they had engaged me, they had asked me questions, they had offered me space before I even started. And it's been this amazingly rich place ever since. But one of the things that happened early on while I was there, and the first couple of years I didn't do anything, and then the next, at presbytery. I didn't do anything at presbytery, right? You go to a new church, the last thing you want to do is get involved in presbytery. So I didn't do anything at presbytery for the first couple of years. Just got, steeped myself in the congregation. But then I got invited to take on a volunteer role at the presbytery, and I said, okay, fine, it's time. It was the chair of the presbytery. Anyway, okay. I think they were looking for demographic representation since I was the only called female minister in the presbytery at that point in time. Clearly, if they wanted a female ordained minister, it had to be me. So I took on the chair of the presbytery. And it was at a really challenging time in the presbytery's history. Leading up to that, while I was the incoming chair, we had been dealing with the remnants of an extremely litigious and very disturbing pastoral relationship breakdown, which had cost the church hundreds of thousands of dollars and almost all the goodwill that the presbytery had with the congregations it served. And so in my leadership, I determined that the most important thing I could do would be to rebuild those relationships, to try to strengthen the relationship between presbytery and the local congregation, and that's what I focused on. And at the time, the Division of Mission in Canada, which I'd worked for about 4 years part-time before I got to West Hill, that they had put out one of their study guides, which had in it some workshops that would be easily done in congregations. So the incoming chair, again, representation, Eilert Frericks, one of the only out gay clergy, they go through their list and get chairs that way. But anyway, so Eilert was the incoming chair. And Eilert and I went around the presbytery, meeting with each congregation initially, and then because we had to speed it up, we started putting them together 2 or 3 at a time. I'm losing myself. I'm okay? No, there I am. We took those workshops to those congregations, and we had some very rich conversations The first thing that people really noticed, and that we noticed as well, was that the people in each of the different congregations, especially when they came together, if they didn't know one another before, and they didn't, the walls between congregations are very thick. They realized that people looked and thought and engaged very much the same way as they did, that they weren't, ha satanas, the Satan in, sheep's clothing, that they were other United Church members that had the same yearnings and longings and desires that they had. And so that in itself was a rich undertaking. But at the end of it, when Eilert and I sat down and started talking about what really had gone on in those conversations, what we learned was that people who came together to talk about their core values and their core beliefs, when it came to the belief side of things, they didn't have language to talk about it. They didn't know how to talk about their beliefs. And so they fell back onto traditional concepts and language that they'd used as children, or that they still heard in the hymns that they sang in their church services, or that they could pull a piece out of the Bible maybe that they remembered from long, long ago. But most of them didn't have the language to talk about any kind of belief system that may have evolved, unless, of course, they were someone who was theologically trained or had worked in another level of the church and been exposed to people who spoke in those terms on a regular basis. And that was the beginning of this all, really. Because what it came down to was really that there were two kinds of people in every congregation. The people who knew what you meant when you used all that language, and the people who thought they knew what you meant when you used all that language. And those were two very, very different groups of people. And in the coffee hour, you probably couldn't tell them apart. You couldn't tell them apart even in the service, right? Because they were all standing up and singing the same words to the same hymns. They were all listening to the same thing. But in the coffee hour, they didn't talk about their beliefs. They didn't usually talk about the sermon. They didn't talk about anything except what was going on in their lives and stuff like that. So you couldn't really tell these people apart, right? But I had just learned through this 2-year process that there were two very distinct groups in my own congregation. There was a group that had for 20 years gone to a book study and studied all those classic, Spong, Crossan, Borg, Armstrong, Pagels, had studied all of those people. And so they knew when I used the word God, I didn't mean the God called God. I didn't mean a being who lived in heaven and who was going to take me home and hold me to his bosom when I died. I meant something relational. I meant something that we had the responsibility to create in the world. I meant something that you couldn't just nail down, but they had to have evolve in your life and then through your life into the world, right? That's what I was talking about. And then there were the people who thought I was really meant the God that we were singing about and reading about and talking about, literally. And those two different things had to be addressed. And so that became a significant element of my leadership at West Hill, that focusing on removing the barriers to understanding. Because how many of you go into a conversation intentional about being misunderstood? We don't do that, right? A conversation the root is convert, to convert someone to your understanding. So they have to know what you're talking about if you're going to convert them to your understanding. So I wanted people to know what I was talking about. But as long as I used words that obscured that, then I could almost guarantee that there would be people that would leave on a Sunday morning who didn't know what I was talking about. And so I began having that conversation. It started one Sunday morning when, perplexed by that whole question, which had been stewing for several months at that point, and the challenging realities that had taken place not far from here when a colleague's young son was torn from his arms in a hurricane and killed. And the following morning, the newspaper had a picture of a family with a young child, and the headline said, "God took care of our family." And I was so devastated, by that headline, and adding it to the reality that people didn't know what I was talking about when I used the word God. I recognized my complicity in that kind of worldview, and I could not do that anymore. Of course, I didn't really know what to do, and so my brain went on, I hope this happens to all of us, but my brain will totally block me from what it's conspiring to do on my behalf. And so one Sunday, when I needed to preach a sermon which was not prepared, it was one of those weeks, 3 weddings and a funeral or whatever, and 4 weddings and a funeral, usually 4 funerals and a wedding, but anyway. I got there on a Sunday morning and I didn't have anything, and the administrator, Peggy, would peek in the door and say, "Are you okay?" "Oh, I'm fine. So I didn't use notes when I preached, so no one's going to know whether or not I am prepared because I just come in empty-handed anyway. So I just felt that I would have to get up and it would come, right? I'd hear the passages, and at that point in time we were already doing an alternate reading, so I could hear that and something would come out. And it did. Big time. My brain decided, hey, this is the moment we've been waiting for. And so I just took God apart and really refused to allow anyone to leave that room thinking that I believed in a theistic God, or thinking that I believed in a God that had the power to intervene in the natural world or in the natural order, or even had the power to influence my thought so that I would act in a different way, which is a more passive kind of intervention. A God that had any sense of supernatural power at all, whether as a being or as a force. No one was going to get out of that room with any thought that I believed any of that, including myself. And at the end of that, doing all that, I sat down, and I've told this story many times, but I find it was so unbelievable. I reach for the bulletin because I never know where I am in the service, and I look at it and it goes, intercessory prayers. So I got up and I did them. Yeah, and at that point in time, the response was, "Oh God, in your mercy, hear our prayer. And for this, oh gracious one, we give you thanks." So I knew that things were significantly different at that point. So I contacted the chair of the board and I said, we need to have a talk. And clearly that was true. Before I get to the board meeting, though, I never had more hugs after a service than I had after that one. And people that wouldn't let go, like I was having some kind of a breakdown in their mind, so they just wouldn't let go. So anyhow, so we get to the board meeting that week, and I recognized that I had stepped, and I don't record this part because they'll use it against me, I know, but I had stepped outside of the bounds of our relationship, right? That's not what they had covenanted with me to do. And so the question was, were they still willing to keep me? And I quite recognized fully that they could totally release me from that covenant. In fact, I expected them to do so. But after a brief conversation about the impetus for what had come forth on that Sunday, they mused about it for a while, and then once asked me, "So, okay, but what would it look like if church, if we let go of all that stuff? And what would church look like?" And I had no idea. I said, I don't know. And so they talked for a bit amongst themselves, and then they said, "Well, let's find out." And honestly, I said yesterday in our small group, and I've said it, or in one of the groups, chatting groups, I've said it many times, that clergy who don't believe are a dime a dozen, but a congregation that will say that is rare indeed. And so it is West Hill who is really the story that has evolved and unfolded over all these many years. And since that time, we began the work of creating a theologically barrier-free community, our gatherings, language policies. Scott wrote our language policy, which really states that we won't represent from the front of the church any beliefs that we can't prove or that aren't substantiated in some other way beyond personal experience. but we have created a community where people have a diverse understandings. Some believe some things, some believe others, some don't believe anything at all, except the market or something. And so we allow for anyone in the community to believe anything at all, but we will only represent a certain perspective from the front. And if someone is speaking who has a belief system, they're welcome to share that, as long as they say, this is what I believe, and not this is the way the world is, or this is how the universe operates. It's this is how I order my life according to this belief system. So that's what we have really developed there. And once we got that going in 2004, we had contacted Jim Adams and asked him, if we could become members of the Center for Progressive Christianity, even though we thought they were rather conservative. And he said, sure. So we did. And then, like anyone who puts their hand up and says anything in church, you get tagged with a volunteer role. And that's how starting the CCPC began to unfold and happen. And then my focus has been on the CCPC, sharing the work of that across the country, and then internationally, and writing books about it. And that, that's been my focus, and that's as far as I really want to go with that. So now I want to speak a little bit about Chautauqua. Are many of you familiar with Chautauqua? Okay. Chautauqua grew out of the Sunday school movement in the late 19th century, when Sunday school was really the only opportunity for children to learn, because they were often working at those times. And so Sundays they would come together to schools, and the Chautauqua movement brought teachers together to give them the tools and the knowledge that they could take back and share in those Sunday schools. So it focused on the arts, on literature, on religion, and on something else. I don't know. Science, I guess. So it would teach those different things. And the movement went across the states, and there were Chautauquas that were independent of a place and would travel around and share those programs across the country, across Canada, and across the states. But in New York, they have preserved Chautauqua, which was actually a place where people went on an annual basis to learn these things. And it is now an institution which carries on that heritage and brings people together for 9 weeks in the summer. For each week has a different theme, and that could be on science or the arts or literature or religion. And they would bring those together. So this year, Scott and I got married there in 2003. Sight unseen. I don't know how many brides that choose a place sight unseen, but it was lovely, and we've gone every year. So this year, the theme week that we chose to go for was called Crisis of Faith. It was the religion theme for the year, and it was called Crisis of Faith with a question mark at the end of it. And I was really excited about going because there were a number of people that I knew, who I had connected with online, who were going to be speaking, and I was going to be able to connect with them there. And also I was going as the chaplain for the United Church of Christ Denominational House, which was lovely to be invited to do that. When they invited me, I said, "You do know who I am, right?" And she said, "Yeah, that's why we want you to come." And I said, "Okay, great." So I was there for a week with them, and part of these conversations around the crisis of faith. And in the afternoon, every week throughout the summer, at 2 o'clock, there's a religion department lecture. And those lectures have featured all of the names of people that you would be familiar with. John Spong speaks there usually every other year, and he's scheduled to speak there again next year, despite his stroke and recovering from that. So that's wonderful to know that he's going to that. Marcus Borg has spoken there, Dom Crossan has spoken there, Karen Armstrong has spoken there many times, Elaine Pagels. I mean, it's just a list of the who's who for progressive Christianity. It also has leaders in Islam and in Judaism. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs was there this year, not in the religion lectures, he was in the morning lectures. But it's a whole spectrum of religious presentation that takes place in the afternoons, and there's usually between 1,500 and 1,700 people at those lectures, and there's about 3,000 to 5,000 in the morning lectures. So it's a happening kind of place. And during the week of the Crisis of Faith, Bill Moyers was the afternoon guy, and he was interviewing people. So you got 5 afternoons of Bill Moyers interviewing these incredibly interesting people. So you can understand why I wanted to be there. Some of the people that I wanted to meet, one was Robbie Jones, the Public Religion Research Institute in the States. He's the CEO and founder of that, and it puts out statistics, has a fabulous daily news information if you want to follow that. But he was going to be there, and I was really looking forward to meeting him. And Greg Epstein, who many of you will know, is the the humanist chaplain out of the humanist Judaism tradition at Harvard. So he wrote the book Good Without God, which was on the New York Times bestseller list back in 2009. So he's very well known, and we've connected many times, but I'd never met either of those two. So one of the things that I noticed at Chautauqua this year, which I had never experienced before, is that when people, at the end of the morning lecture, which is the one with 3,000 to 5,000 people, they collect questions. They'll take them by tweets, or they'll take them by paper, and then they're sorted at the front, and the lecturer answers them. But for the first time ever, people were identifying in their questions, I'm an atheist, and I want to ask you this question, or I'm one of the nuns, and I want to ask you this question. People were identifying as having no religious belief. Maybe it was the theme, Crisis of Faith with a question mark, that gave them the permission to do that, but I had never noticed that happening before. And it happened both in the morning lectures and in the afternoon lectures. So that was something very new. It speaks to the rise of the nuns, which in Canada in 2011 were practically at 24% of our country's population identified as the nuns. And in the States, it's getting close to that as well. The fastest growing religious group in the United States are the nuns, and probably here in Canada, though we've been growing them for quite some time. But one of the people who was interviewed by Bill Moyers in the afternoon was Alan Cooperman. Alan Cooperman is the person who is the director of the religion section of Pew Research. So when we read those statistics or read articles in newspapers or in national magazines or something that have to do with religious statistics, they often have come out of Alan Cooperman's work that he's done at Pew Research. Robbie Jones influences quite a little bit as well, but he's a relative latecomer to this work. But Pew Research has been there for a long time. So when we hear about the nuns and how their numbers are rising and things like that, it's often research that has come out of the Pew Research, and Alan Cooperman has taken care of the oversight of that. So he brought us statistics about mainline religion, tearing that bandage off. We all want to sort of feel that everything's okay, but he was ripping it off, saying, in terms of Protestant Christianity, your numbers are down, they keep going down. In terms of this, that, and the other thing, they're going down. Participation in religious groups. I've always wondered about that category on the census that says Protestant. I figure they're really nuns. Because if you identify as a Protestant, you probably haven't been to church in a few generations, right? And you know that your family had something to do with that, but there are no denominations called that. So I kind of add them in to the nuns when it comes to that number. But Alan Cooperman, at the end, you get to do questions, and there's microphones and people line up, and someone asked Alan Cooperman a question. And he said, so who are the gods of the nuns? And Cooperman thought for a moment and then shrugged and went, shopping? And a woman came up to me later, and I had self-identified at some point during the Q&A, and so she came up to me and she said, did you hear what he said? I was going to put my umbrella through his eye. And it was a particularly rainy week, and she had an umbrella, but I don't think that he really had taken the pulse of the group. I think he assumed that they were what many Chautauquans are, white, affluent, and Christian. And I don't think that he even had really thought carefully about the reality that there would be in the audience people who were part of that group that he was saying was the fastest growing religious group in the country. Why wouldn't they be in the audience then? So he had seriously offended some significant numbers of people in that group. So here's where these two things come together. Because when I heard that out of Cooperman's mouth, I wasn't quite umbrella angry, but I really felt dismissed. He felt that the number in that group that are spiritual but not religious is really only about 3%. Most of them, like the United Church survey or the United Church Observer survey on the United Church, which was conducted a few years ago, that showed that, most people don't know who the United Church is, they don't know what we do, and they don't care. It's not that there are so much of that group is spiritual, looking for a spiritual home, and they can't find one. It's that very few of them are really even interested in finding that. There's this huge group of people out there that are not particularly interested. And so I was deeply offended that he would just write them off as shallow and, self-absorbed and materialistic. To say that that's who they are seemed blindingly wrong, glaringly obviously wrong, and he seemed to miss it. But when I started to think about what I know about the nuns, I have to acknowledge that I'm an Alan Cooperman. I have some statistics about them, but I don't have there's no information there about what they do because we've only ever studied them as a religious group. So we've only ever talked about them in terms of what they don't believe, or where they don't go to church, or what they don't want in terms of religious engagement, or whether they're spiritual but not religious, or not spiritual at all. We've only ever explored them as a religious group. And I'm as guilty of that as everyone else, particularly because my focus has been so confined to this idea of theological language. I have constricted my perspective to barrier-free theological space. Do you think the nuns give a damn about barrier-free theological space? I'm pretty sure they don't. So although I've spent the last 16 years of my life championing that, I have systematically disconnected myself from one of the fastest growing religious groups in the country. So I want to go back a little bit now to try to get a sense of who they are. And I'm going to use almost exclusively religious language to do that. Or religious topics to do that, falling back on what I know to try to dig into what I don't. And the first thing I want to focus on is, to get there, is the thing that is the most common to all life on the planet. And Albert Schweitzer, when he finally gave up on that quest for the historical Jesus, when he realized that whoever went searching for Jesus ended up finding a Jesus that looked just exactly like that person that was doing the searching. So he decided to look a little more fully at the world and at life and explore it more deeply. And he found one common element amongst all life, and that is the urge toward life. That no matter what a living thing is, be it a bacterium, or be it a human being, or be it a plant or an animal or anything, it tries to replicate itself. Its DNA requires that it do that. It's a product of evolution that calls that out of itself. And so we organize ourselves in ways that will replicate who we are. We protect who we are so that our DNA can be repeated. And our DNA was pretty vulnerable early in our lives. Like, we were vulnerable to almost everything. We're not at the top of the food chain. I'm hoping they changed that chart that they used to show us. We were on the top of the food chain. Take our guns and our weaponry away, and we're like way down there. Like, we're just gonna get eaten for dinner. So we had to come up with things that allowed us to survive and thrive. And religion was one of them. It was one of the ways that we could cohere in groups that would cooperate, that would take care of one another, that would protect groups, known groups. And so the things that divide religion, like the way we dress, or the foods that we eat, or the things that we say, and the way that we talk, and perhaps the way that we move, all of those things identified a group that made us safe. And in those groups, we could learn to thrive. And that's maybe that, and the ways that communities came together that mimicked that, or maybe religion mimicked the other, whatever. That's what allowed us to beat off the wild world that was trying to kill us on a daily basis. We found ways to replicate and care for ourselves. And that was an important first step. But religion, the image that I have is of the strangler fig. Religion is like the strangler fig. Like any plant that's trying to survive, it needs to get to the sunshine. And so it's going to use whatever source it can possibly do to get there. And vines will climb up trees. That's how they survive. That's how their DNA modified itself, so that they could get to the sunlight. They could grow up the tree. And strangler figs will use a palm or whatever's at hand and grow up that in order to get to the sunshine, sometimes killing what is in the middle in the long run, but eventually being strong enough to stand on its own and get that sunlight that it needs. Religion grew up around humanity, looking for that thing that would allow it to survive. And it became the replication not just of our own human DNA, but of our social norms, of our cultural norms, of the ways that we protected one another. And religion thrived on that until it got strong enough to stand on its own. And then I think it stopped giving a damn about the thing that it had grown up on. It stopped caring for that human element that it was hoping to preserve, that was its sacred soul. And it found the replication of itself more important than that human story. So I think that the systems that we use sometimes to replicate ourselves they strangle us. So that urge toward life is something that we have found through our religious institutions and cared for. In Christianity, some of the most significant elements of that I talk about in Amen, which I think is a great book, though I really didn't go very far. But I talk about some of the most significant things about the God called God. And that is, in our tradition, the God called God is the source of all goodness, the agent of goodness, and the promise of goodness. So let me unpack those a bit. Within the religious tradition, we could see things that were good, and we would name them as having come from God. That God provided us with the things that were good in our lives. And we got them because we acted in certain ways that were consistent with what our religion expected of us. And God would, shower goodness down upon us. And if it didn't seem good at the time, well, it was a window to something else that was going to be coming that would be better. So God was the source of all goodness and the agent through which goodness came into the world. So God named what was good, and then God brought it to us, right? Those are the two major things. And the third major thing was that even if life sucks, God was going to make things better in the long run. So God was the promise that good will out, no matter what the circumstances of your life, no matter where you were born, or what kind of hardships you had to endure as a result of, the accident of your birth. You could end up in paradise, in this heaven that would provide for your every need and want, and it would be good, very, very good. And that's what our religion has offered us. That's what the strangler fig of Christianity has presented to the world. And that's what the nuns refuse. They want none of that. They don't want anything about this extraterrestrial God that jumps in and saves us on occasion or lets us perish. That worldview makes no sense to them. But in Amen, I talk about shifting that worldview. And Scott was a big part of creating this concept, in that when you take that God away, that supernatural, theistic, otherworldly God, or that force that brings goodness into the world, when you take that away, what are we left with? We're left with us. So how does that fit into that source, agent, and promise thing? Well, we're the source of goodness. And someone was asked a question about evil yesterday in our group, and we are the source of goodness and evil, and it comes about through the Word. There's this odd little connection with John's Gospel, but we say whether something is good or something is bad. We name it that way. And so your gardens are filled with flowers that are good because you call them that way, because you want flowers in your garden. And you pull out the weeds because you don't want weeds in your garden. You name that. They're both plants with the urge to live. But we name them as good and we name them as bad. And the same thing with all our human behaviors. And they shift and change through the course of human history. The things that we call good are no longer the same as the things that were called good 500 years ago, hopefully. And the things that are called bad now are the things that, maybe waste in another 100 years or more, or maybe 20 or 30. They shift according to our definition. So we are the source of goodness through our naming of what is good. And we are the agent. Yeah, okay. I'll just turn this off. I'll take this. Okay, here we are. Thank you. So we are the agents that bring that goodness about too. It's in our hands to make something good or to not. We have the opportunity. And in Houston now and wherever there's a disaster, it's human hands that bring goodness to that situation. Despite the fact that the Attorney General for Texas has refused the help of Quebec, asking the people of Quebec, rather than take their blankets and their medications and their other things that they were offering to provide, for them to simply pray for them. The actual helping of that situation will come about through human hands. So we are the agents of goodness. But we cannot promise goodness. We simply can't. There is no promise of goodness. We can look to each other for the possibility or the potential for goodness, but not the promise of goodness. So why am I going into all this? Because I think the nuns are human, like all of us. And so I'm going to go a little deeper into Amen, into that book, in order to talk about what I think they need, what I think they yearn for. Because I think that's what's at the core of that religious endeavor, are those things that we yearn for as humans, that through the course of time, religion has learned to take advantage of in order to survive and replicate itself, in order to help us survive and replicate. But now we can maybe disentangle ourselves from it and find those central things ourselves. And so I go back to the elements that I brought out and reflected upon in Amen, and that is the 4 different kinds of prayer that are most prevalent in our Christian gatherings. And that's prayers of adoration and confession and thanksgiving and supplication. Those are the 4 kinds of prayers, and we do all kinds of different iterations of them. But they come down to adoring God, confessing our failings before God, thanking God for all that goodness that God has brought into our lives, and then asking God for the things that we need. But if we disentangle it from that concept of God that no longer works for many of us, and certainly does not work for the nuns, we find those very basic human needs. The need for awe in our lives, for wonder, for seeing what is so exquisitely beautiful it stops our hearts, that calls us to reach out to another and say, can you see that? Can you hear that? That says we can all find beauty in this world if we pause and take a moment. The awe that we feel when we're exposed to a new way of thinking, when something so interrupts our normal way of living that it changes who we are. My therapist taught me a tapping procedure, a tapping procedure that so helped me disentangle anxiety from grief that I was able to walk back into a relationship that I thought I would never be able to walk back into again. That was awe. I was filled with awe that I would have the privilege to be back in that relationship because someone taught me how to tap my body in some peculiar ways. That was amazing and a gift that I will always, always appreciate. Awe comes to us in so many different ways, and I think everyone in the human family deserves awe in their lives. Remorse. Instead of confession, where we're giving up what we did to a God that's going to make us feel better because 5 seconds after we say it, the clergy person says, okay, and now you're all okay. Remorse is something we sit in, something that makes a mess of what we thought we were, something that refuses to let us get away with the person that we've been living as, and says, you know what? In all that stuff you say about living in right relationship with yourself and others on the planet, get over it. If you can't actually do this right, you have no right to say any of that. Remorse calls us to look at our relationships with everything. And we are convicted almost every time we do that carefully. We don't want to really spend a lot of time doing that. But as humans, we must. And so just as we need that, so too do those who are identified as nuns need that. And Thanksgiving, that's an easy one. Nuns won't talk about Thanksgiving, they'll talk about gratitude, perhaps. What is gratitude? How do we find it? Where does it come in my meditation the other day, and Scott will be embarrassed by this, but in my meditation the other day, gratitude came up, my concept of gratitude, and I was to be thinking about what I most was grateful for, and what came out was those moments after being together as a loving couple, when you just lie in that beauty, and you give thanks for that. And I decided at that moment that all those moments that I say, oh, thanks for this, thanks for this, thanks for this, I'm going to weave them into a quilt of gratitude instead of just moving past that moment. We need gratitude. We need to be able to express it, to experience it, to weave lives out of it, and so do the nuns. And finally, supplication. What is it we desire? How is it we want to live? What do we want to see the world look like? How can we be part of that? To place out there, beyond what we have the capacity to realize ourselves, the ideals that we want to live by, to place them out in front of us and call ourselves forward to them. I think that's what institutions like the church are for. I don't think they're to constrict us in certain behaviors and things. They're to say, this is what's right. This is how we desire to live, and how are you going to do that? How can we help you do that? Every human needs to have an idea of what they can be, of what the world can be, of what the future might be. And we need each other to find our way there. So those are the things that I think the nuns are shopping for. And those are the things that I wish we could provide. And those are the things that I need to lift my head from the rhetoric of theologically barrier-free language and find ways to provide so that we can offer to a world fragmented so many times by belief, one that thrives beyond belief, and in which the nuns can perhaps be our most fruitful and energetic and committed leaders. Thank you.
We have a few minutes to have some questions and answers. And then we're going to give you a chance to have a little stretch break before we come back to our panel. So this is a time for you to offer your questions, and there will be a microphone we'll place here in each aisle if you want to come to offer your question. Gretta is graciously willing to respond. So if there's something that this conversation has evoked or provoked or stirred in you, please feel welcome to come and place your question with us. I've answered every question.
Thank you so much for what you've said and the images that you've given. And I'm playing with the image of the strangling vine. And it makes so much sense to me. But I don't see any sign of religions realizing that they're strangling the tree that's feeding them. Are there any? I mean, I know the United Church is closing buildings and saying we're in a dire strait and this sort of thing, but it's not prompting them to feed the tree. Have you any comments about that? Why people are blind to that?
Well, I think that it's because of Schweitzer's urge to live, right? So those institutions have found patterns that have allowed them to survive. And so they replicate those patterns over and over and over again. I think it takes a new organization almost to come up with a new pattern. And I don't know that our traditional religious institutions can do that. I believed very passionately that the United Church had it in them. I was convinced they had it in them. I think I'm being proved wrong about that. But I think that an organization that felt as its DNA an urge toward justice in all of its different iterations, social, economic, gender, environmental, all of those, that it had created a pattern that allowed it to step outside of the traditional demand that we fall back on the Bible and the doctrinal beliefs, that those are what will cause us to grow. And had, as I've said publicly, that I felt that the United Church always held the Bible accountable to love. And in every iteration of a justice issue, it found a way, perhaps parsing Scripture or the words of Scripture to do it, but found a way to live out its desire to love. And that's like Jonathan Haidt's righteous mind, where we make our decision and then we rationalize it later. We knew what was right in those situations, and we found ways for our faith to accommodate that. But one of the expert opinions that has been written for my hearing argues that the United Church has never held the Bible accountable to love. So when it's being interpreted in that way, that is falling back on those previously written scripts that I believe are unhelpful. So I'm going to talk tomorrow about how we can move beyond that into something else that may feed the human family more deeply in the future. So thank you. Keith was a member of the very first board of the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, so welcome, Keith.
Thank you, and now I know why I was drawn to this conference. Not by some being, but by wanting to hear you again. As you know, I'm not only a post-theist and a post-Christian, but I'm a post-Christian now, so I'm a nun. In fact, I'm a non-religious chaplain to universities, and they call me the chaplain for the nuns. So I just want to thank you deeply for your talk. And my hope is that there can be, as we, on the agenda I see on Sunday, we're going to talk about where do we go from here. I hope there can be networking and resources for people like me who've left the Christian faith, are still promoting Christian values, but they're the same values every faith promotes, every healthy faith. And if we can just broaden the tent to include those of us who no longer use the label, because I just got tired of saying I'm this kind of Christian, not that kind of Christian, so I just don't use the label anymore. But thank you so much for that talk. It just resonates with what I'm doing on campuses.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you.
I use the label, rather than atheist, to describe myself. I use the word secular humanist to describe myself. And I have not yet been invited to leave my congregation. The reason I stand here is because I do not know how to make what I'm hoping to happen. And hopefully the other people in this room might be able to act in a manner that might bring to fruition what I'm about to ask. And my question is, would you be willing to allow your name to stand for moderator of the United Church?
I think by August 2018, one of the criteria is you have to be a member of the United Church, and I don't know that that's going to hold, but thank you for that. Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could say a few words about your understanding of creation, creator, and the rest of your philosophy.
Okay, just a few words about that. And the word creation is one that we use. So it's such a beautiful word, right? So we use it regularly. But there is an implication in that word. And during some of my journey, I've talked about the intimations and the implications of the words that we use. And that headline was one of those. God took care of my family. What does that say, right? What are the implications of that? So using the word creation has become more difficult for me. And so I when I hear myself say it, there's this big thing goes on in my head, like, whoa, because that intimates that there is a first being that created the world. And seriously, I have no idea. The greatest minds have spent their time trying to figure out how we came to be. And I have no idea. So I identify as an agnostic when it comes to reality and to how we emerged in the way that we did. I believe in evolution, but what started it, where that first, speck came from, I'm guessing right along with the rest of them. So I don't really know that. In terms of our yearning to be in relationship with one another, I think those are, again, it's all neurological as far as I'm concerned. I think that we have developed the capacity in our neurological fibers and in our brain to love one another and to protect one another and to defend one another to the death. And I think that capacity, though it's neurological, is awe-inspiring and galvanizing. And I think that animates what I do, not just physiologically, but in the realm of values and love. And these 7 teachings are animated by that which, boils down to dust, really, and the way that dust is put together. So I stand in awe of all of that. I don't think that my amazement of it has been diminished one iota because of the loss of, or the absence of, the belief in a prime mover. In fact, it may have been enhanced by that. So, thank you. Before I go to the next one, were you wanting to ask the question? I'm sorry, she was here before you. She was just behind you. So if she could come forward, sorry, thank you.
I'm intrigued by your, as I understand it, that you're trying to find a language to articulate the experience of the divine mystery without falling back on the traditional language of biblical and ecclesial dogma.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's sort of the macrocosm. In the micro sense, how does that reflect on our interrelationships as humans across language barriers. I'm from Quebec, and I wonder how much our ability to understand where someone else is coming from with a very different language is also part of this process.
Absolutely. Scott and I live together, and we are so often on completely two sides of the same sentence, as many of you in marriage probably have experienced. You know, being able to come to a common understanding of something is extremely challenging at times, but crucial for relationships. So how do we do that? And one of the ways that we do it at West Hill is to try to use everyday language to talk about what it is we're talking about. So, if I use the word God at West Hill, I would need to say right after it exactly what I mean by it. There is a word that I use regularly at West Hill that I follow with a definition because I haven't found a word to replace it, and that's the word sacred. So when I use the word sacred, I say, by which I mean that which is so essential to our humanity that we cannot risk losing it or denigrating it. Every time I say the word sacred, I have to say that, right? But we just don't have a word that's better than that yet. So I think that finding the lowest common denominator in our words can give us a plane upon which we can have a conversation. And that is how interfaith dialogue often works, is coming to what it is we mean underneath all of that. And that, I think, is how conversation takes place in Starbucks and in relationships. It's finding what do we mean underneath those technical terms that we may be using or the assumptions that we bring to something so that we can have the conversation.
It means our conversations will be extremely lengthy as we carefully articulate the nuances of each word that we use.
Yes, absolutely. But we are so worth it. So let's take the time.
The 2-hour sermon.
Okay.
Greta, if you don't mind, I'm just going to moderate this so that you don't have to keep your eye on this.
Right.
Warren, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I'd just like you to elaborate on the anagram, SAP, that you used in your book, Amen. Mm-hmm. I'd just appreciate if you could just expand that for the
people. I use SAP, and that's like the root of sapiens, which is wisdom, Homo sapiens. So the wisdom that we can bring to this conversation is that recognition of our responsibility for our actions. So how are we going to act? And I talked about out here these ideals and these values and this hope-filled picture of what we want our lives to be and what we want the world to be. And as we move toward that, and we go back and forth all the time, we move toward it, but by 11, you get up in the morning and think, I'm going to move toward that, and 11 o'clock in the morning, you're, oh my gosh, I've been going this way all morning so far. So we have to constantly remind ourselves of that, I think. And I think that religious traditions have the corner on those simple little things that can remind us, right? The proverbs and the little scriptural passages and that we can hang on to that have helped us find our way in the past. And so the sapiens anagram, SAP, that we are the source of goodness, that we are the way it's going to come into the world, and that we have the potential to do that, but it's not going to happen unless we engage. That's one of those little things that can help us move in this direction more confidently. So if we hold on to that, and we at West Hill, we have what started as a children's prayer when families wanted us not to teach the Lord's Prayer to children, and we called it the children's prayer, and then we called it our prayer, and now we call it words of commitment. That's another one of those little things that reminds us regularly, this is how I said I wanted to live. And how does that happen today? How do I make that happen today? But I think that the sapiens thing, the SAP, can do that on an even more focused way. Like it just calls us to that question every decision we make. I used to say years ago that every decision we made was either for or against our baptism. How many of you have said that? Oh, come on. Other clergy have said that. No? Okay. All right. Well, I don't say that anymore. But every decision we make is for or against our sapien, our wisdom. that thing that connects all of us. Thank you.
Just going on from there. The SAP in your book stands for sense, action, and then you changed the P to participation.
Source
So
agent.
could
Yes.
you expand why initially the P stood for something else, but now you sort of expressed that participation is necessary?
I think I was talking about possibility, not participation. That there's the potential for goodness in our acts. Participating in the human endeavor, the human experiment, is a responsibility I think we have, and I think that one of the things that we've lost with the loss of mainline religion is that accountability that we felt. And so those of us who remain engaged still feel that accountability, but larger and larger portions of the population do not feel that accountability because they're not part of that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow as well. So, thank you, Warren.
Scott, you were jumping up and down earlier. Did you need...
I think you can wait, though.
Okay.
Well, this woman has been waiting
That's
a long
good.
time. I mean, I don't want to take over
No,
the
that's fine.
moderating, but she's been standing there a long time. Sorry.
You know where you stand.
I'm fascinated by a chaplain who works with the nuns. And my wondering is, what would that curriculum look like to get the training in awe, remorse, gratitude, forgiving, supplication, without all that complicated stuff? And not only for chaplains, but for each of us and whatever leadership would be called otherwise.
That's a brilliant thought. I spoke with Mark Toulouse, the principal at Emmanuel College. Sorry? Oh, put that on the board, yes, yes. I spoke with Mark Toulouse a couple of years ago about starting a program at Emmanuel College for humanist clergy, if you will, that would invite them into leadership roles in ways that could encourage and sustain communities of nuns. And we had an excellent conversation about that. He was very willing to do that, as long as I found 150 grand for him. So, you know, with that being the only barrier, I don't know why it hasn't happened. But there are implications of that happening within a Christian theological institution. And it's the same thing that happens for those that go through that program for leadership in the Jewish community and in Muslim communities. And that is that you still have to translate. Like, you still take many of the same programs with the same language and you have to translate it. I think we need to create, and I have no idea how that's going to happen, but I think we need to create opportunities for people to come together for that training in a very real and very concrete way. And we need to find ways to do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow too. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Greta, for all your words of wisdom and for inspiring us to live our highest values. I attended an interfaith presentation in 2007, and I wrote this, which I didn't come to this congregation until July 2011, but I still have this question. I said, I'm wandering in a desert of not enough information. I'm a Christian, Roman Catholic by birth, but not by belief. I'm looking for meaning within the Christian tradition. I'm very interested in the search for the historical Jesus. And based on what I have read, we should be reading the Torah. The whole story of Christianity may be the story of Judaism sidetracked by Paul. Now, is that crazy or not?
No, I think that's a pretty perceptive understanding of it. I think that if we had maintained the wisdom and the traditions of our elders in faith, we would still be arguing about these things instead of having written them down in concrete form in the 4th century and requiring belief in them. They would have remained a much more dynamic element of our faith, and I think that we would have we would not be where we are now. We'd be light years ahead of where we are now because we would have allowed that exploration and that engagement and that conversation. So I lament that we shut it down and institutionalized it in a way that I don't think early Christians would have wanted or expected, and certainly upon which we can no longer thrive. So I think that's a very good question, and I think it's one that you need to keep asking.
Was it not also by the misuse of language for a purpose?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. What do you mean by the misuse of language? What language? Which language?
Well, for example, Paul told possible converts that they didn't have to be circumcised. And I think that was for a purpose. He wanted converts. Whether or not being circumcised was the right thing or not really didn't enter into it, did it? And I think, a lot of this was just propaganda. I mean, we get it today, too. Mm-hmm. It's twisting things around to suit a purpose.
I think in my first book I refer to Jesus as I don't know, maybe I used Marcus Borg's words and said, he's this itinerant preacher with a great posthumous marketing team. Because it all happened long after he died, and people put it together and took advantage of the story.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
I think we can have one more question, and then we'll move toward a break.
I'll answer yours later, honey.
Thank you very much for the great ideas you've presented. They're new to me anyway. In terms of the paradigm that we're talking about today, can you surmise, or have you already thought about what the afterlife might mean to the nuns, how they might view that?
That's an excellent question. I think that what we're going to find in a post-Christian context, and we have to acknowledge that a post-Christian context is not a post-religious context. There are, the growth of faith traditions around the world is going to continue, and there are some emerging as very growing at extremely fast rates. But in a post-Protestant context, I should even say, not even post-Christian, post-Protestant context, those conversations, I think, will be rich because the sort of carapace that has been around them has been cracked open and removed. So the conversation can go almost anywhere now, and I think that's where it will go with the nuns. Being in a relationship with someone who I adore and who makes my life incredibly richer and more vibrant than it would be without him, we often talk about that. Like, what happens when one of us dies and we don't have anything there, like it's not there? And I talk all the time about, at funerals, about how, you are in everybody's heart that you did those movements for today. And you're in the heart of everyone you've ever talked to. So we have a responsibility to embed the most beautiful of ourselves in other people's hearts, because that's what lives on. And for Christmas, I gave Scott a star. I had the opportunity. You have the opportunity. You can buy a star and name it, right? So I gave him a star for Christmas. And that's where we're going to go. That's our story. That's the story that's going to take care of us. We're going to be on that star together. But I think that we have to tell those stories. David Eagleman, who is a polymath, incredibly brilliant man, he's written a very small book called Sum, S-U-M, and I think it would make an excellent study in a congregational context. He tells 40 stories of the afterlife. He just makes up these 40 stories, and they're brilliant because each one of them convicts us or surprises us about the realities of life and looks at it from an afterlife perspective. So it's a brilliant, I would highly recommend it for that conversation going forward. But I'm very delighted that conversation will burst open in the future. Are you going to let him ask the question, or do we have to go?
Gretta told me yesterday never to give you a mic again, so I'm not sure why the change of heart.
First of all, I was not at all embarrassed to hear you say that the best part of there. Second of all, I was the one sitting on the couch beside you when you actually added the word atheist to the banner on your website. And I remember this is exactly what I thought. Not because you aren't and I'm not, but it was what that label would say. And everywhere we've traveled, the work you've done to undo the derogatory baggage in that word, which has nothing to do with morality.
Thank you.
So my has turned into a yes. Right? And lastly, I just want to say, because I want to say at this celebration of CCPC, that apart from the arguments that we have, which are rich and rewarding, and I often lose, what you are at the microphone at the front is exactly who you are, and I honor that. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gretta. Thank you. We're appreciative of this morning so far for Gretta, for all your questions, and for the way we've been engaged and challenged, and we're grateful that the morning can continue. We now have a time for a break. Please make the facilities available. There's water and needs here on the table should you need them, and we'll gather back here at 11:15. We'll be called.